Welcome, everyone, to Talk Back. I'm Sheila Horvitz, and it is now post-election season, and we're very happy to have with us someone who is going to give us a review of how Connecticut voted, what happened with early voting, both in the primary and in the general election. So please welcome my guest, Stephanie Thomas, the Secretary of State of Connecticut. Hi, Stephanie. Welcome again.
Hi, Sheila. Always happy to be here.
Okay. So we had a discussion before the election, and one of the big issues was that we had passed early voting. And for the first time, we had early voting during the primary season in August and then in the general election in November. Tell me, did it help to increase voter participation? Let's talk about the primaries. What happened then in August?
Yeah, so interesting. So we started early voting. We actually had three elections this year. We had the presidential primary way back in April,
Oh, that's right.
where turnout in both parties was only about 8%. But there's not that many voters eligible to vote in primaries in Connecticut because if you're unaffiliated, you can't vote. And that is actually our largest voting bloc. Um, and then, yes, we had the primary in August. On the Democratic side, I believe turnout was about 15%. On the Republican side, I jotted a note about 8%. But again, there weren't a lot of races that people had a lot of interest in. So when you go fast forward to the general election, we saw a lot of participation, and over one third of eligible voters voted early.
Okay, so in terms of the primaries, we had, I live in Colchester, we had a judge of probate primary, and the winner, the Democrat, George Baker, touts early voting. He said he got more early voting votes than anything else, and I think he won by about 50 votes overall. So he thought early voting worked for him in that election. But I think one of the questions I had was, shouldn't early voting lead to greater participation and more votes? Did we have more people voting in 2024 general election than in 2020? I think nationwide we went down, at least the Democratic participation went down. Tell me about that.
The same is true in Connecticut. A lot of people think early voting is like a magic wand that increases turnout. But I think what other data has borne out is that voters tend to stay relatively static, but the method that they use may change. So, for example, states that have universal access to absentee ballots, early voting, and election day voting see the greatest numbers using absentee, then early, then election day, which makes perfect sense because election day is just one day and a lot of people are at work or busy with their lives. Um, so maybe over time we might see a slight boost, but Connecticut, like the rest of the country, was down in overall turnout. In the 2020 election, we were at 79.7%, so almost 80% turnout. This election, we lost a full 100,000 plus voters, and our overall turnout was only 76%. But it's really hard to compare apples to apples when you go from election to election because the details are always different. It depends on the candidates who are running, it depends on the issues that people care about. It can depend on things like weather. There's so many variables that impact turnout. But that said, the number of people who turned out to vote during early voting, 742,000, far exceeded any estimate that our office or the registrars had for their towns. So to me, it's a symbol or a sign that over 60% of voters said they wanted early voting. So they got it and they used it. and I was traveling around during the early voting period, and um, polling place after polling place, there was a real upbeat mood. Regardless of political party, everyone I ran into was so appreciative to have the option so that they could fit voting into their very busy lives. Anecdotally, I heard a lot of stories from registrars about seeing more people with disabilities and more seniors out and voting. And I saw an example of that myself. I was actually out in Sprague, and a woman came in, elderly, with a cane, and she asked for a chair. And they had chairs there, but she said, "Oh, I need a chair with two arms." And it was early voting. It was quiet. They were able to go to another room, get a chair. And then she was there for about 20, 25 minutes voting her ballot. And I just thought, what would her experience have been if it were just election day voting? That sort of customization and customer service just wouldn't be possible. So I think it was a resounding success, and everyone I've spoken to has just been so grateful to have that opportunity.
Yeah, no, I loved it. And in my town, a group of us gathered on that first day of early voting. We did a little demonstration. We walked together to the town hall. There were lines. It was exciting to see lines and enthusiasm, but it didn't follow through for the whole thing, right? Because we had less voter participation. And so I was really hoping that early voting would be an engine for greater amounts of participation overall. That didn't happen. And compared to 2020, when we had the COVID and we had so many mail-in votes, we had more participation with mail-in voting than we had with early voting, right?
And that's what happens. Like I said, states who have all three, they have found that most people participate via mail in voting. And that name is a bit of a misnomer. Mail in voting could also be in Connecticut, voting in person at your town clerk's office or dropping off your ballot in a drop box. Um, so, again, there were so many factors at play. I know when I travel around talking to community members, earlier this year, I thought participation was going to be down by at least 10 points, because when I would go to speak with any audience, I would say, "Who's registered to vote?" And hands would go up, and I would say, "Who votes in every election?" And they would kind of drift down. And then I would say, "Who plans to vote in this presidential election?" And a lot of hands would go down. Um, I just think people were not excited about either candidate, honestly, earlier in the year. And people weren't really like making it their number one priority. So, in my opinion, turnout, I think we saw some last minute excitement on the Democratic side, which helped boost turnout. So I was actually happy it didn't go down lower, because prior to 2016, overall turnout, I don't have the Connecticut numbers offhand, but it was closer to like 68% or 70%. So then it jumped, and we've maintained these high levels, but now I think we're starting to see it drop down again.
So another question about early voting and counting the votes. I noticed in my town of Colchester, it took much longer till later until the evening to count. Is that because the early voting votes go into the same box of counting as the absentee ballots, and they're not and is that the case in all the states all the Connecticut towns? It made the vote count take that much longer?
It depends. This is so nuanced and boring that no one wants to hear all the details, but essentially, tabulator machines, that you feed your ballot into, have to be coded for certain ballots. And every town has a limited inventory of these machines. So in Connecticut, early voting ballots and absentee ballots cannot be counted until election day. But also on election day, all these tabulators, you have to, by law, have a backup for every tabulator that you have out at a polling place. So depending on how many additional backups towns had, that depended on how many they were able to use for early voting and absentee ballot counting. And unfortunately, or fortunately for election security, you can't just say, like, oh, I need extra machines, let me bring them in, because there is a period of time by law that you have to test the equipment, ensure that it is counting correctly, and then that machine has to be sealed for a certain amount of time before you can use it to count ballots. So towns weren't able to say, like, oh no, I have more than I thought, let me bring in another machine. So depending on many, many factors, some towns finished easily, and some towns had planned a lot of extra machines, but more, like, there were, like, my town in Norwalk, over 1,000 people showed up every single day of early voting, and they had many machines allocated to the count. But you also have to remember, our machines, you have to feed the ballots through one at a time. And if there's any discrepancy, you have to do it again. So some towns took longer than others. Some towns who were piloting the new tabulators, some of them had high speed counters, which do 200 ballots a minute. So those towns finished on time as well. Like all things elections in Connecticut, your experience totally varies depending on what town you were in.
Every town, even though you oversee what goes on, every town manages their own election
Yes,
process,
yes.
right? But is there any way that one can start to tabulate these early votes and absentee ballots earlier, or no? This just has to be done.
Absolutely. It just has to be set in law. You
Okay,
may recall in 2020, because they allowed everyone to vote by absentee if they were concerned about health, the governor had put into place a special emergency order, which allowed, our absentees have the 2 envelope process. So it allowed the registrars to open the outer envelope so they could sort the ballots by district. And that saved a lot of time. We hope to change some things about early voting next year, which we'll be proposing to the legislature. But many states do allow ballots to begin being opened and processed, not the results released, but processed from 3 days to 1 week before the
okay.
election.
And then there are some states like California, our largest state, the most voters. Why is it they take weeks and weeks to finish counting? I mean, that
But
seems
part of it
crazy.
is due to their size. People, Connecticut seems large to us, but compared to most states, I was laughing and talking to some fellow secretaries on election day or prior to election day, just saying, like, hey, we finally have early voting, because they make fun of Connecticut for that. And, in good fun. And it's been a great success. Like, we've had over 500,000 people show up at that time. And, a few wrote back like, oh, that's so great. We've already had 4.5 million show up for early voting. These are huge states. California is immense. So in terms of doing all the post-election numbers, I believe they allow absentee ballots to be postmarked by election day, not received by
So that's,
election day. So if you have a county and you get hundreds of thousands of these things, it takes time.
but isn't it the same for every state? Each municipality or town counts its ballots separately and then sends it to their secretaries of state?
Not, I would say every state is entirely different,
Oh,
but
different.
regardless, most states will have some sort of county administrator. So the municipalities are sending it up to the county, and the county may be doing something, and then it goes to the Secretary of the State or the entity that certifies. Not all secretaries handle elections. And in some states, it is the state that actually counts the ballots. So they are delivered to the state designated location.
I see. Okay. So one final question on early voting, and that's the cost. I know when the town halls or whatever place you would to do your early voting had to be open, you need to have it staffed by at least one person or more. It costs money. So I guess the final question is, in the end, since it did not give us greater voter participation, was the price worth it? I think you say yes, it is because it still helped.
I
But what's
I
your answer to that?
I was in the legislature and I got to vote to put that question onto the ballot. And a lot of people talked about greater voter participation, but that's not why I support early voting. And I don't think that's the purpose of early voting, right? I think it's an aspiration that if it's more convenient, more people can utilize it. For me, it is to make sure that people who want to vote have equal access to vote, which is why one of the main groups that was a proponent of the bill was AARP. The story I told you about the lady who took 25 minutes and needed a double arm chair on election day, that is pretty much not possible. She would not have been able to stand in a line or wait or get that type of customized service. They talked about a lot of seniors on medication who don't know their good days from their bad days in advance. And that's also true for people with unreliable transportation. Again, I think of like my mom was always dependent on getting a ride from someone. And what if that falls through on election day? So for me, it has always been about accessibility and making sure that anyone who wants to vote is not tied up. People like me who used to commute to New York City for my job, it was hard to get to the polling place within those 14 specific hours. And that is why I say it was a huge success. And so clearly, many people needed that opportunity or wanted that opportunity because they didn't want to risk that some sort of life emergency. If it happened on election day, they just wouldn't be able to cast their ballot.
Okay, well, that's where another initiative comes into play, and that's the no excuse
Yeah.
the absentee ballot. So you could,
Yeah.
instead of early voting, you can just get an absentee ballot without any excuse. So we passed that referendum. What
Yes.
was the percentage that it passed by? Do you recall?
Um, I forget offhand, but it was about 900,000 voters voted yes. So pretty significant in terms of percentage of turnout, which was about 1.7 million. Um,
Some
uh,
people, Stephanie, complained to me about the placement of the question on the ballot. Now, did that change town to town, how they printed them up? But
it did change it town to town.
some people in
And
my town said it was at the very top, and some of them missed it. They missed the question.
ironically, I filled out my ballot and I was about to leave the table. And then I said, oh, wait, there's a ballot question. Where is it?
Where
And
was it on your
it
ballot?
was at the very top. But like my mind just saw instructions and then the box underneath, but I saw the whole thing as just instructions. And I only went back because I knew it was there. Ballot design is very complicated. Every
Sure.
town does its own. We actually do have a bill that we've proposed in the past and that we'll bring back so that our office can have final approval of ballots because we've had issues where the translation for Spanish ballots had an error. We've had issues where someone chose a two-sided ballot, but only one office was on the back. So there was a big drop off from page one to flip it over. So there are a lot of things that are embedded in ballot design that we'll definitely, hopefully, keep chipping away at.
Yeah, that's an interesting question because ballot questions are important and
Yeah.
we want
And
them
some
done.
towns had multiple ballot questions, like local questions, and it also got lost there sometimes because they might have had three or four other questions.
So we need it's an art in and of itself, ballot
It's
design.
an entire science, and there are entities that work solely on ballot design. And I would love to see Connecticut change how we do our ballots, and hopefully we'll get there.
Oh, that's great. All right. And so the other question is now that we passed that referendum, how is it going to be implemented? What's the next step?
It's a good question. Obviously, the legislature are the body tasked with determining that. I have been looking at all the different ways to run these types of programs. You know, there are 28 states that have universal access to absentee ballots, plus all the 8 states that are totally mail in voting only, no election day in person. So I've been looking at that. Our current system is really designed for low volume turnout. So I would not suggest that we keep the same system with universal access. All the states with universal access have much better security features built in, ballot curing procedures built in. Right now, we can't open our absentee ballots until election day, and there is a rejection rate. And it's all linked to public education. So if you take 2020, for example, there was $2 million spent because of the pandemic, and we had gotten that CARES Act money to explain to the public the absentee ballot process, how to make sure it's not rejected, and that cut the rejection rate in half. When I look at elections prior to that and the ones after that, the rejection rate has gone back up. So if we, for example, just kept our current absentee ballot system that has no cure period because they can't be opened until election day, if you look at that math, we would probably see about 15 to 30,000, depending on primary or general, ballots that aren't counted because they're rejected. So there are a lot of security features, voter protections that need to be built in. If I could have my wish list, we would pass a law this year that was a two-step process. 2025, commissioning a study and looking at how other states are doing some of these things for rollout in 2026.
So interesting. So people should be aware that even though we passed the referendum, it's not automatically self-executing. It doesn't happen until the legislature passes a formal bill that tells you exactly how it's going to work, right? People,
Correct.
I
And
think people,
oh, sorry. And I was going to say, I'm a big fan of civic education and civic engagement. And when the early voting bill was being discussed, I think about 100 people wrote in and about 65 showed up to give testimony about what they thought early voting should look like. That's not a lot of people.
yeah.
So I hope while it's being discussed in the 2025 session, that a lot more people who have a specific point of view make their voice heard, because it's easier to impact an issue before a law is passed than to change it after it's passed.
So that brings me to the question of other states that are trying to suppress votes and not count votes. And those absentee ballots seem to be a prime source to try and invalidate votes. You know, the two envelopes, and you have to sign it here and put the right date. So across the country, you heard stories of 25,000 ballots thrown out because they missed the date. They had the wrong middle initial instead of the other middle initial that, and then there are ways to cure it. So these are traps, aren't they? There needs to be some, I think you said, some methodology for being able to cure a mistake on an absentee ballot. It's not fair to not count my vote because I put S of my middle initial instead of V or whatever, right?
Yeah, election law is very complicated, and yet most lay people just have no idea what's legal or not legal. And many of us started voting at 18, and we have this assumption that things have remained the same. Whereas laws around elections and procedures can change a lot from year to year. So it's incumbent upon us as voters to keep up with what is legal and not. As a secretary, I can't say that people shouldn't follow the letter of the law, right? We have to invalidate things all the time. There have been candidates trying to get on the ballot who literally just forgot to sign the form.
Yeah.
We can't validate that. Like, we're sorry, there were instructions, you didn't follow them. That's the law. But what we can do is build in what you said, curing periods. I think it's really important that as you tighten security and as you adhere to the letter of the law, that you give some sort of opportunity for people who made an honest mistake to have the ability to rectify their vote. Because there's no public education out there about most of this stuff, I don't blame the voter for not knowing how to correctly fill out the envelope or, miss the letter and whatnot. So I would argue for two things: a ballot curing process and an investment in public education.
All right. So, as the Secretary of State of Connecticut, I'm assuming you belong to a national organization of secretaries of state. But we know from the reports and the election controversies that there are some secretaries of states who would rather see people thrown off the rolls, would rather make it harder for people to vote. How do you and your organization and the different groups that you belong to, how do you deal with that? Because it is a thing in America today. There's no question about it, right?
Yes, I belong to the National Association of Secretaries of the State. I have the pleasure of serving on the executive board. I'm sorry, there's so much light coming in.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Not sorry about that. Not every secretary belongs to this membership organization, and I would there were about 43 states who belong, and I would suspect I might not have the opportunity to meet people who don't believe in voter access because maybe it's a self-selected group. They don't join the National Association. We have a pledge amongst each other. We do not speak about other states because we don't have the details. Laws change so much, like they vary so greatly from state to state. By way of example, just to give you a little example, in Georgia, uh, like 2 years ago, something changed with voter ID. But in Georgia, 98 or 99% of their voters are have a signature on file with DMV. So because of that high participation rate, they were able to make that change, and it sounded worse on paper than it was in actuality because 98 or 99% of their voters were already accounted for. Now, if a state had made that same change where only 50% of their voters had DMV profiles, it would have been cataclysmic. And I just offer that as an example because there's so many variables. It's often not as simple as it sounds. But make no mistake, there are many people out there, and they don't have to be at the secretary level. They could be at the county level or at the municipal level. I don't think any other state has the system we have, where we have a Democrat and a Republican in every registrar office across Connecticut. So there have been cases I've heard about election administrators at the more local level in other states who, were saying things like, I know there's fraud, I'm not going to certify the election, like well in advance of the election. Ironically, I haven't heard about anything given the outcome,
But these impulses to say things like that, it's a fairly new phenomenon over the last, I hate to say it, over the last Trump years. Before that was maybe an isolated thing, but there did not seem to be a drumbeat from a certain segment of our uh, electorate or voting
well, there
officials.
certainly wasn't this feeling that election fraud was some sort of pandemic, right? There have always been cases going back, but never enough that it would have tilted, significant outcomes. It's always been very small margins that every single researcher, conservative or progressive, have borne out, like 0.00001 of all ballots cast. But I always say, we just have to remember the same people we knew in kindergarten are the same people who are adults, right? There were some people who were nasty people, some people who followed the rules, some people who broke the rules, etc. Like, we all just grow up and we don't, like, those same percentages.
Yeah, but if they have a national champion who takes on their ungrown-upness, then you got a problem. Yeah, yeah. So that's too bad, but we'll see how that goes in the next few years. Before I get to voter education and civic education, I know you want to talk about that. One final thing. On election day, there's always some kind of glitch or something going on. Did you have any on this election day where you had to intervene in a community or something
Oh,
was
of
happening?
course.
Yeah, yeah.
There
So
are
what were
always glitches that happen at every election, but usually they repeat themselves. It's the same type of glitches, like someone trying to have a campaign slogan within the 75-foot rule. So it's usually pretty easy for the moderator to just ask them to either remove the clothing or step aside. There was one incident where someone did not want to move, I believe, a vehicle that was parked within the 75-foot rule with a sign on it, and law enforcement had to be called, but then that got resolved. We always have tabulators that go down because these machines are almost 20 years old. But again, that is not cataclysmic because there are procedures in place if the tabulator goes down while you're waiting for a new one to come out. So we definitely had those types of things again. But by and large, it was pretty uneventful, I have to say.
oh, no, we didn't read of any major things in the papers, so pretty
Yeah.
pretty
We didn't
pretty
even yeah, I won't even talk about all the negative things that happened in other places. I'll just knock on
okay.
wood. We didn't have
So
them here.
So in terms of equipment, will there be improvements to the equipment? You said some are 20 years old. How does that work? Does the
Yeah.
legislature have to pass a law about that? Can you
So yeah,
requisition
so
them?
so the legislature has to release bonding, which they did last session. And then the bonding commission has to actually give us that money. And they gave us most of it again last year. So we started a RFP process which concluded in September or October. So it wasn't enough time to get the actual equipment, but every town in Connecticut will have new tabulators by the November 2025 election. Yeah.
Sounds good. So, what in your mind is the most important thing that needs to be done in Connecticut as far as increasing registration among young people, voter participation, and of course, voter education, civic education?
Yeah.
What are your heart's desires, and what programs have you initiated or want to?
Almost. I don't think we have enough time on this program to
Okay.
talk about my heart's desires, but um, there is a lot that the Connecticut legislature has already done that is amazing. Um, what we lack are the resources in our office to actually carry much of it out. So, more funding in elections in general, I think, is really important. Elections are getting more and more complex. And every time you talk about greater voter registration, voter access, there's like time and labor involved in all of those steps. And at the municipal level, a lot of registrars haven't seen a boost in their salary. People would be shocked to learn that despite the hundreds of hours of early voting we had over the 3 elections this year, all the special training that was needed, all the meetings around putting together a brand new plan, most registrars were not paid one additional dime for all of that work. And I challenge people to ask themselves, would they have put in an extra 300 hours for free? But they did it because it's important. It's their job. It's something, they really believe in our democracy. But I don't think they should have to take on all of these new things without additional compensation. So looking at
How are their salaries set? Through the towns or through the
through the
state?
towns, through
Through
the
the town.
towns. And just to give you like a hint of what we're talking about, most towns in Connecticut do not have full-time registrars. So like the lowest paid registrar in Connecticut, I believe, is $5,000 a year. So think about taking on all that extra work when it's not your full-time job to begin with. So we have to make sure the laws that are being passed fit the structure and the investment that we have. We passed in 2021 automatic voter registration using data from agencies other than DMV, other agencies that prove citizenship and identification, but we haven't had the resources or time to roll that out. And for me, that is one of the best ways to get people registered to vote.
So what kind of agencies would those be that, like the
Like
Department of Motor
think
Vehicles?
like the main one would be Department of Social Services. So
Okay,
people who are qualifying for things like Medicaid,
okay,
Husky, etc.
right,
Um, and I forget there. Yukon,
okay.
and a few other agencies. But it's a long process. It requires a big database because you have to tie that data together on the back end. Early voting, of course, we did, but we also have a new voter registration system and a new election reporting system rolling out next year. So we have to train everyone in that. The Connecticut Voting Rights Act passed last year, but we haven't had a chance to start implementing the main piece of that to make sure voter protections are in place, given some of the changes that were made to federal law a couple of years ago. So what I would most like to see is sort of a pause in sitting down and coming up with a holistic plan so that early voting, no excuse, election day, we come up with a system that works together, that we think about how we can save small towns from some of these costs. Because, what we did learn in early voting there are towns like Norwalk that saw over 1,000 voters a day. There are other towns that saw over 14 days, like a few hundred voters, and it's very expensive. So um, I would just love to look at a holistic system with funding mechanisms in place, including public education, because what I have found is that a lot of people blame apathy for non-participation, but when I go out and talk to people, I hear a different story. So many people have said to me, I don't register because it sounds complicated. Or I didn't go vote because I wasn't sure I didn't feel educated about what was going to be on the ballot. So, like when I came to Connecticut, I was shocked that no voter guide was mailed to every resident, because I've never lived in a state where I didn't get that in my mailbox, which told me where to go, what's on the ballot, and like all those details. So, there are things we could do to boost participation. Um, Other than those types of policy reforms. And I think public education is a big piece of that.
When everybody gets a social security card, why can't that be an automatic voter? Once you have,
Um, you know, it's probably that might be complicated because now you're mixing federal with
oh,
state.
okay,
Um,
you're right.
but
It's to be
one
state run.
bill we've put in the last couple of years is allowing 16-year-olds to pre-register. And then basically because they're all getting learner's permits. So then basically when they turn 18 or right before, they would get a mailer to confirm, their status, where they live, etc. Um, Even something as simple as that in and of itself would help boost registration rates.
And what about finally more education programs? Should there be more civic education in the schools? Should be there programs that your agency initiates? Should the registrars in towns initiate these education programs? What do we
All of
do?
the all of the above, definitely in schools, but the State Department of Education is also over a barrel. Every time you add curriculum, you have to take something away. So I think and they have done this, creating civic standards that teachers can incorporate from K through 12. So I would love to see more teachers, not just social studies, but think about civic engagement and civic education more holistically across all disciplines. One of my dreams, we are trying to put together, we have something in writing now, on our site, called powerofcivics.ct.gov. Where we are trying to teach people of any age, how some of these things work at the local level, state level, and federal level. I would love to see it turned into like a online learning tool, where community members could just learn at their own pace. Because for me, civic education is lifelong learning, because it's impossible to learn it all quickly in every local municipality, state, and federal government all do it slightly differently. But you want to have that knowledge when you need it and not wait until you need it to try to figure it out. So we are working on that. But overall, whether it's federal government, state government, or local government, I think all three entities need to look at how we're funding civic education, because ultimately it's how we're funding our democracy. People don't just automatically believe in democracy or understand how a representative democracy functions. Like everything else in life, it's a learned skill. So if no one's teaching it, well, guess why we see low participation rates? Because people aren't invested, they don't know, they haven't received the information. So I think we just need to do better across all three levels of government.
Right. So I want some final pep talk thoughts, because when you said people are apathetical, apathy is inexcusable when you are a citizen and you are the government. People don't realize that. They think of the government as something far off, when it is us, right? So give us a final pep talk about how citizenship means. You can't say that I don't like either candidate. You've got to vote. Why?
Yeah, like I don't blame people for that view because no one is teaching us this stuff. They really aren't. And I don't blame them, but what I tell audiences all the time is that whatever you believe, someone is elected and those people make decisions about just about everything in your life. And those tentacles are very long. And you might not think of it as government. Like I was telling a story to some young people. I got a scholarship to college. I lived in a affordable housing area of the town where I grew up, so I was able to take a bus to get to that college and use the scholarship at NYU. If I hadn't had that affordable housing near the transportation, I couldn't have used that college scholarship, and where would my life be? It'd be very different because my family didn't have a car. And you don't think of that as government, but someone decided to zone that street as public. Someone decided it should have those transportation lines. And someone, decided all of these things that have shaped our lives. So I, for one, would rather have a voice in who is making these decisions. And I think if people thought about government that way, more, they might, and if they knew how to make their voice heard, I think they'd be more likely to get involved. We can
Great.
do it. We are the
You're good.
people.
That's it. So thank you so much, Secretary of State Stephanie Thomas. And it never stops, because 2025 we have our municipal elections. So we'll be talking to you then. And enjoy the day and the weekend, and we'll see you soon. Thanks everyone for watching Talk Back with Secretary of State Stephanie Thomas. Bye.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.